Welcome to Reading the Room, a literary podcast featuring author interviews and discussions with bookish content creators. I am your host, Jalen, also known as The Bar in the Bookcase on YouTube. Today, I am so excited to be joined by Bryan Washington, the best-selling, award-winning author of Memorial and Lot. He joins me to discuss Family Meal, an irresistible, intimate novel about two young men, once best friends, whose lives collide after a loss. Cam is living in Los Angeles and falling apart after the love of his life has died. Kai's ghost won't leave Cam alone, his spectral visits wild, tender, and unexpected. When Cam returns to his hometown of Houston, he crashes back into the orbit of his former best friend, TJ, in TJ's family bakery. TJ's not sure how to navigate this changed Cam, impenetrably cool and self-destructing, or their charged estrangement. Can they find a way past all that has been said and left unsaid to save each other? Could they find a way back to being okay again? Or maybe for the first time. When secrets and wounds become so insurmountable they devour us from within, hope and sustenance and friendship can come from the most unlikely source. Spanning Los Angeles, Houston, and Osaka, Family Meal is a story not only about how the people who know us the longest can hurt us the most, but how they also set the standard for love. With the signature generosity and eye for food, sex, love, and the moments that make us the most human, Bryan Washington returns with a brilliant new novel. Family Meal is published by Riverhead Books, an imprint of Penguin Random House, of which I am also an employee. If you like this episode or if you enjoy Reading the Room generally, a great way of supporting the podcast is leaving a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts, or sharing this episode or the podcast with family and friends. This is an independent podcast, so any shares are greatly appreciated. Now let's get into the discussion with Bryan Washington. Bryan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Jayla. It means a lot.
I've been a fan of yours for a long time, and I instantly want to talk about this book, in conversation with your other work, but I want to start and just ask you about where this novel started for you and how did it differ or kind of feel in conversation with your prior work?
I think that for me, questions that had felt on the front end of a lot of Memorial, questions of community, the different forms community can take, questions of home, the different forms that home can take, questions of intimacy, and the different forms that intimacy can take were top of mind in initial drafts of Family Meal. I knew that I wanted to write a narrative about queer friendship. I knew that I wanted to write a narrative that was attempting to catalog the ways in which the ebb and flow of a relationship between two folks can just shift over time, and it becomes an active thing, an active act of care for them to have to want to figure out how to meet one another and whether that meeting would be in the middle, who would cede what as far as care is concerned, who was willing to change what about themselves as far as care was concerned, and what could not be changed. None of these questions have static answers, and none of them have, I suppose, certain answers. The answers are going to shift from context to context. So I think each book, in some ways, is its own particular context in which I am trying to problematize the very same questions. But because those questions are inexhaustible, it gives me quite a lot of leeway to work with.
The opening paragraph, which is from you, and it serves as a sort of content warning for what's going to come in the book. When did you land on including a message like that for your readers?
I wrote the book from the very end of 2019 through, I suppose, the very end of 2022, in that zone. And since the onset of our current pandemic, I have grown to really appreciate the ways in which an artist or an author shows care to their audience or to a reader, not only necessarily in the work, but also in that implied relationship between a piece, between a text, between a visual component, an audio component, and the person who is spending time with it. A really palpable example of that for me was Mary H.K. Choi's Yoke. That book also begins with a note to the reader, letting them know that certain themes, certain scenes in the text might be challenging for them, depending on the experiences that they have had. And that, I think, was and feels like such a distinct and emblematic instance of care that I knew that wanting to write a book about care, wanting to write a book in which folks are navigating these same questions themselves, it felt really prescient to at least attempt to nod to that same act of care, that same act of grace. I also asked my friends from the outset, hey, is this something that you would be into, or hey, is this something that would be cool? And I received a wide range of answers, but many of them, all of them, actually circled around this question of wanting to be cared for. So the challenge became, okay, like how can I do that in a way that feels honest and true to the book?
That's interesting to hear because it extends even into the epigraphs, which is like one of my favorite things to ask you about, or to ask any author about. It's just 'cause I feel like it lends so much to what's going on thematically. But the first one that I want to ask about is from Alejandro Zambra, in his book Bonsai, which I read. I forget when I read it, like maybe last year, but it blew my mind. It's a tiny little book that is just so moving, so masterfully crafted. And I feel like this book is definitely in conversation with it. And the epigraph is, "This is then a light tale that becomes heavy." Open floor about all three of the epigraphs that are included here, particularly Alejandro Zambra and what that book means to you.
Yeah, so for the Zambra quote, Bonsai was the first work of his that I had read, and it really shifted my sense of what was possible in a narrative generally structurally, but also what was or what could be possible in a narrative of that length, and the ways in which a narrative's length didn't necessarily explicitly dictate the amount of emotional weight that could exist inside of that narrative, which is to say, like, I felt it really deeply, like it was really impactful for me, but it's quite a short book. That notion of a tale being both light and having quite a lot of emotional weight, or a narrative being able to balance levity while also balancing solemnity, like that for me was important, like in the drafting process, because in a lot of ways that mirrored the arc on the generative end of the book for me. Initial drafts, particularly thinking of the ways in which, Family Meal started as like a short story, before progressing to, about 10,000 words. And then upon, the onset of the pandemic, I threw most of those words out because it didn't feel as if though they had the weight that felt most prescient to me, just as a reader, just as a person. So it was only through, I suppose, drafting and gaining a sense of who these characters were, what their world looked like, and the ways in which their world mirrored, the world that we are sort of collectively experiencing, and the ways in which that shifted, the ways in which those two shifted in tandem with each other, that I began to have like a firmer sense of a foundation for what I wanted the story to be. One of the results was that it became like a touch heavier than I initially intended. So that quote, in a lot of ways, like just felt really prescient and really immediate. There's also a bit from a track by Yutaro Hikaru, called Bad Mode. Yutaro Hikaru is like, they're an artist that like I'm just really enamored with generally, but that track particularly, the ways in which it as also balances like levity with a sort of seriousness, or like an attention to the ways in which these things can exist simultaneously, felt important to me. And there's also a brief exchange from a film called Lucky Chansil, an independent Korean film that came out a few years ago. And that particular line, "Flowers return with the seasons, if only we could too." The film itself, like, is quite light, I suppose you can say. It's not like a deeply solemn film, but there were these moments, or like these blips, in which the amount of emotional weight that had been built up over the course of the project of the movie really presented themselves to the viewer, and that just felt and feels really impressive to me, and also really relevant to what I was trying to do for Family Man.
Yeah, I mean, that goes perfectly into my first question for you about this book because it's about many things, but I feel like at its core, it's exploring grief. And yeah, so I guess I just want to ask you about how you thought about writing through grief and trauma and balancing the sort of light and heavy aspects of this, because I feel like you do it so masterfully and with this like with grace that I feel like would be so like hard to pull off. So I'm just curious how your brain is working when you're thinking through those questions.
Yeah, that's very kind of you. This book was extremely challenging, right? I think I've said that like in different capacities, not, being one of the exact reasons. It started as a short story. Ultimately, it's, somewhere closer to like the 78,000 word zone. But in the midst of that generative process and in those drafts, something that I had to reckon with was balancing my disdain for the ways in which narratives published in the American literary fiction ecosystem that are featuring marginalized characters, oftentimes, and generally through no fault of the author, oftentimes it's just like a market thing, a publisher thing, like what they think will sell, what they think has comps, or what is seen as like front facing as having value. There can be a way in which these narratives featuring marginalized characters, particularly queer folks from these marginalized communities, like capitalize solely on the traumas or the challenges that these characters face at the expense of every other component of their life. Generally, that's not the sort of thing that I'm interested in reading, which isn't to say that there isn't validity to these narratives. There is, and there are many that, that are quite essential. But the issue for me is the ways in which it can capsize the entirety of a narrative and be tracked as the experience in its totality in lieu of a particular experience of a particular person or of a particular community. I knew that I wanted to write a narrative about two queer folks who were trying to figure out what their relationship was. And in those initial drafts, I was really fighting back against allowing challenges of the state, challenges of or particular to their communities, thematic challenges to supersede that relationship. But I reached a point where I hit a block maybe halfway through the generative process or like the initial drafts of the narrative. And I found that this was largely because in an attempt to work against including what I thought of or what I conceived of as being traumatic, I actually wasn't letting the world into the narrative, and it wasn't as comprehensive of an iteration of their respective experiences as it could have been. So what ultimately ended up proving to be like a corrective to that for me was working to find balance between levity and seriousness, between pleasure and joy and moments of despair. That is what in the end felt as if though it would be closer to like a simulacrum of like life as it's actually lived. But I also found that having and nodding to the ways in which life can just be quite challenging for folks from these communities underlined and accentuated the moments in which they were able to find pleasure and the moments in which they were able to find joy and the moments in which they were able to illustrate care for one another in many facets. That question of care became even more pronounced once the inclusion of these difficulties, some of these difficulties, found their way into the novel. But it took quite a lot of drafting to reach a point where I felt as if though that balance was comfortable for me as a reader, first and foremost, to say nothing of someone who wanted to tell a story.
This book, once I closed it, I was flipping back through and just like structurally how you're able to do this is so fascinating to me because we get three perspectives in this book and you jump around in time and you use like vignettes and just different, you include pictures as well. I'm wondering, how you, for each, perspective that you give or even the number of perspectives that you decide to include, like how do you land on your style as a writer and the way that you structure your novel? Because I feel like they're so singular. And if you like open one, you kind of know that it's a Bryan Washington book, but it also just works really well. So I'm curious if you have anything on that.
Very kind of you. Thank you. Uh, it's also extremely challenging. I mean, but I also think that for me, an interest that I've had from book to book, and this could change, but it hasn't changed yet, is narratives that are approachable, so to speak, at the line level, at the level of prose, but whose structures are quite dexterous, like insofar as I have like tangible goals from project to project, and maybe more specifically from long form project to long form project. It's that I want to continue expanding my sense of what is possible in a structure or what is possible in like a microstructure inside of a pre-existing structure that a novel may have. For Family Meal, I knew that I wanted it to be a relationship about two queer friends who are just trying to figure out like how to make it work with one another, two people who want to make it work with one another, but perhaps they don't have models for what that looks like. They don't have clear arcs that they have seen that have been established for this is how I want to be cared for, this is how I want to care for this person. But it also feels true to me that in a relationship or a narrative of a relationship between two people, it didn't feel emotionally honest or even structurally honest to give credence entirely to one of the individuals in that relationship, right? Because that's solely one vantage point. So I knew from the outset that at least two narrators would be present over the course of the text. And it was only after I had the personal reckoning of how many challenges I wanted these characters to face that the third narrator, Kai, entered the text. And another decision that I think radically shifted the novel was to make Kai like an active voice, right? I don't think it's a spoiler at all to say that Cam is a character who's grieving the loss of his partner Kai. I knew that was true from the outset, but it did not occur to me, and I did not try to include Kai's voice in the present tense until much later in the drafting process. If the entire book took about 3 years or so, I wrote Kai's sections, which are much shorter than Cam and TJ's, but nonetheless wrote them all pretty quickly over the course of like a week and a half at a friend's apartment in Berkeley. I just stayed there and I just wrote it. That I think even the beginnings of that and including that in the book radically shifted this structure that had already existed and that I already had thought made a sort of logical and emotional sense, even just including, that 5,000 word bit in, this larger work. That inclusion just moved in an entirely different direction. And that also is something that I found that I'm really interested in, the ways in which small shifts or seemingly small shifts or relatively minuscule shifts at like the line level in a larger or longer project can give the entirety of that project an entirely new shade, right? Including a vantage point that hadn't been present in a project can radically shift like a reader's sense or an audience's sense or my sense as the author of what the project is about, so to speak, or where it's going, so to speak. But it also feels quite true to life, and that we receive like a small detail or a little bit of info that we hadn't had prior to that moment, and all of a sudden, our sense of what is true or what is valid or what is relevant to us in a particular scenario shifts and changes as well. So, trying to find different ways to model that in the text so that it feels not necessarily one to one with lived experience, but it's because it's not, but to emulate that sense of like discovery or of surprise and learning about a new person or learning about a group of friends or like learning about a community whilst they're learning about one another simultaneously feels important to me.
Yeah, it makes me think of the title and the way that you're speaking about this because so the title is Family Meal, and I'm wondering, is that where you kind of landed on the title? Was this idea of kind of getting like a gathering or like a collective of a collection of perspectives? Because with me hearing you talk about this now, in the sense that tying it to a family meal setting, one, it's comfort in food and sharing and gathering together, but you also learn probably, I don't know if the most is the right word, but you learn a lot about other people in that kind of setting when everyone gets a chance to kind of give their perspective. So I'm just wondering, how do you land on the title for this book?
I think my initial thoughts about it were exactly that, right? I was less concerned about the food on the table, so to speak, than the act of sharing and the act of bringing what one has. So this sort of like communal shared experience, right? Like a family meal isn't generally a meal that is partaken by like an individual, right? Presumably, there are other folks around. As someone who is really interested in this question of like found family and this question of the different forms that bonds can take between people, blood or otherwise, whether they're being intimate with one another or otherwise, platonic or otherwise, or somewhere in between. The image and the sort of like underlying motif of folks just trying to find a way to make it work for one another, and how that won't look the same from person to person. The care won't look the same from person to person. The way that an individual feels about care in one moment could shift irrevocably in the next moment, but they're still wanting to try to find a way to figure it out with the folks around them, or the folks that they hold dear, or the folks that they feel that they are close to or want to be close to. That is a question that, again, for me, felt and feels inexhaustible when, that you ask and that you circle through for as long as you are in those relationships. This was a sort of guiding light for me with each of the characters, and as I moved from scene to scene, particularly in the earlier drafts of the book. And I was really fortunate in that I landed on the title quite early and it didn't change, which doesn't always happen.
I want to dive into, each of these characters. And I guess to start, I'm wondering, you've spoken about how you kind of landed on, adding a certain character into the text or just embodying each of them. But I'm wondering like what that feels for you as a writer in terms of using character as like a core mechanism to explore your ideas. Like, is there a particular character in this book that you felt was easier or more difficult to embody, so to speak? And how do you feel about like trying to capture a new voice on the page when you're deciding on adding a new perspective?
That's really interesting. They were all challenging in different ways, but they were all simultaneously challenging in the exact same way, right? You have a blank sheet of paper with ink on it, and I'm meant to believe, or I'm meant to convince someone that, this is a pre-existing relationship with its own contours and hills and valleys, and you, the reader, should be not only interested in, but like invested in. Like it's kind of a magic trick, so to speak. For Cam, TJ, and Kai, I think that a challenge for Family Meal was writing into a sense of who they were, not only who they were, but who they wanted to be, and the ways in which these two ideas could be in conflict with one another at times, the ways in which their respective sociocultural contexts impinge themselves upon who they were and who they wanted to be, and how that could be challenging sometimes, the ways in which the world around them could be quite challenging for these characters in tandem with all of these other components of their experience. Cam is someone who thinks of intimacy in a particular way, and TJ is someone who thinks of intimacy in a particular way, and Kai is someone who thinks of intimacy in a particular way, trying to find ways to identify the specificity behind that for each of these characters, while also ensuring that they were connected with one another, not even only connected by way of just being in the same book or being in close proximity to one another, right? There's an implicit connection there. If you have one idea next to another, then, your reader, the overwhelming majority of the time, like they'll find or make that connection, but trying to do it in such a way that it feels not necessarily natural, but close to an iteration of what could be, was the ongoing project, and one that didn't really have a clear answer. Or rather, the answer was just like editing and editing and editing and editing. I think that for me, what felt manageable and something that I ultimately landed on as serving as like a sort of model is the way in which, like in Gay World, for example, right? Like it's quite small, and you meet someone, and they tell you about someone else, and by way of this initial person, you learn about the latter person's hopes, dreams, fears, loves, losses, who they've hooked up with, who they're hooking up with now, who they'd like to hook up with in the future, and by way of this degree of separation, we have maybe a sense of who that latter person is, who we've never met, right? Like I have like a composite of that individual, but then you meet that person actually in another context, and you find that they're not that composite. They're not solely the things that you heard about them, or the things that you ascertained about them, or the conclusions that you made by way of the details that you garnered from someone else, a very specific person with their own particularities. And these things can be true at the same time. So the experience that I wanted the reader to have for Family Meal was less of one particular character telling them that this is who TJ and Kai are, and I know this because I'm Cam and I know them, or having the inverse occur with TJ or Kai. I wanted to present as many vantage points as possible, as many viewpoints of and from these relationships as possible to the reader, so that they've now spent time with these folks, with this community, and with these communities, and the information is theirs, and they can come to their own conclusion, the reader, because they've seen what there is to see, right? And in that way, I feel that the book becomes a bit closer, or a project can become a bit closer to being the readers, right? One in which there's a world in which they can live and spend time in lieu of my telling you that these are things that happen to these people and you have to believe me because I've shown you this one particular vantage point.
That's really interesting to hear you speak about that because I wanted to ask you about how you kind of tackle realism because I feel like your books are so they feel like real life and I feel like that's so hard to capture. And I think it's interesting when I, hear certain discussions or see, I don't know, certain like reviews of certain books and people say like, I don't know, it's clear that the writer is trying to capture like something timeless, or like if a writer is afraid to kind of dabble directly in a particular setting or in a certain sort of manner of speaking about something. And I guess what I'm circling around is the way that you're exploring like hyper specificity in terms of setting, time, and the ways that these characters kind of navigate queerness. And so I guess broad question for you is just how you think about rendering reality on the page and whether that's like a metric that you're trying to hit in terms of like immersion for a reader.
That's really interesting. Like, particularly this question of like who is granted the benefit of the doubt as far as having a timeless narrative, or who is granted the benefit of the doubt as far as having this is heartwarming. Like, this is something that you should care about, or this is something that I believe as a reviewer that you can care about, right? I think that oftentimes it's a question of like translatability and what is deemed as being translatable or like immediately translatable, which is to say, is this narrative about white queers like more immediately recognizable as having texture and complexity, as a narrative featuring queer folks who are coming from myriad other communities, right? Like, what is the difference in the way that we talk about these particular narratives? That's something that I circle around quite a lot, and I don't think that there are any like concrete answers there. But probably toward the question of like specificity, like I'm someone who loves a brand name. Like, I love like a contemporary reference. Like, if only because it is grounding for me, right? As far as like having a sense of a place and time for each of these characters, in the same way that we, each of us to various degrees, are like so informed by our respective contexts, not only necessarily our geographic contexts, but like our cultural context, what is deemed as having validity or not having validity, right? And that specificity in some circles can be seen as like a detraction for a narrative or from a narrative. It can seem as if though it is like antagonistic to the reader. Right? For example, in Family Meal, like there are quite a lot of like K-pop references. Uh, I'm aware that there is the demographic of folks who are going to read that and track it, as far as like American readers are concerned, is not going to like supersede the amount of folks who may not immediately recognize, who this group is, or what this track is, or what the connotations of listening to this particular song in this moment could mean for a particular character. But I do think that it adds texture to that particular character, right? It adds a layer of specificity and personability to that particular character, so that when a reader, or if a reader does recognize these things, the connection between them, the reader, the audience, and that particular character in that particular moment becomes that much closer, right? It becomes that much more tangible. And like, this is a very specific instance, right? Like K-pop and like American literary fiction, but to some degree, like we're asking that same question every time that we include components of our particular communities, or the specificities of our particular micro communities inside of a larger narrative, right? Like the sort of implicit query of what can I expect or quote unquote expect my reader to understand without the sort of like explanatory comma or an additional graph in which like I'm detailing what I mean when I use shorthand. What can I expect, quote unquote, expect to read as shorthand to my reader or to my audience in a way that doesn't bog down the narrative so that the scene is a scene in lieu of an explanation of a scene or an explanation of a moment. Every single detail I feel that we include in a narrative is like an interrogation of that question. And I think it can be quite telling who or about who is deemed as having like a viable and immediate shorthand and who is deemed as needing explanation for a particular moment. My general feeling, and I think whether or not this is an active thing or not is an entirely different question, but it's at least present from book to book, is that like I want to be as specific as possible because that to me feels as if though it's more inviting than reaching toward a universality that does not exist in the same way that we could each of us be experiencing the exact same moment, but because of our respective vantage points, it's going to be an entirely different moment from person to person. But the hope is that a reader or an audience will see the specificity, and in the specificity, at least the kernels of something they themselves have experienced or an emotion they themselves have experienced, if not larger shades or larger swaths of their own experience. Right? I don't think that, for me at least, like the fear of a lack of translatability is larger than my wanting to be as specific as possible in hopes of a reader navigating this experience or navigating this text and being able to really exist in this world, even if only because, like, as a reader, as someone who is an audience for other texts, like that's what I look for and that's what I look toward. I don't need for a book that I'm reading to be front facing as quote unquote like relevant to me, right? I don't necessarily need to like see myself or an exact iteration or even like a parallel iteration of myself to another text in order to feel kinship toward it or to feel compassion toward it or to feel as if though it is like working for me on an emotional level or like hitting different emotional points for me as a reader. I just want to like live in the world that this particular author, these particular creators have managed somehow to create. That for me like is a bar that I like to hit on my own because it is what I look toward in other folks' works.
The way you speak about it makes it seem easy, but it seems so hard to do all these things like in your fiction.
Yeah, it's quite challenging in editing, but yeah, it's something I think about a lot in either case.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess an side to that as well in your work is just this idea of dialogue. I mean, I'm sure you get asked about this a lot, but I'm curious to know if in Family Meal the way you thought about dialogue shifted at all, or if you kind of have a similar way that you approach it maybe in Memorial as a writer. Like, I'm just curious to know how you kind of edit your dialogue or how you know it feels right to you.
In writing those initial 10,000 words that I ultimately threw out, it wasn't wasted time because I spent those words with those characters, or at least TJ and Cam, as far as like narrators are concerned. So while exact iterations of the scenes in which they appeared did not make it into the final product or the book as it's being sold, my sense of who those characters are and how they relate to one another and how they relate to duress or how they relate to pleasure or how they relate to joy or how they relate to sadness, that did carry over into the final product in many different ways. That was further like calcified by way of drafting and drafting and editing and editing and editing. I haven't found from project to project, whether long form or short form, a surefire route as far as knowing when dialogue is working or knowing when like a bit is successful or knowing when an exchange, particularly if it is like a more challenging exchange, is working at the emotional level that I would like it to work at. But for Family Meal, something that was really helpful, just like as a foundational note between each of the characters, TJ, Cam, and Kai, was beginning from the standpoint of understanding that these two characters or these three characters or any of these characters in this particular world want to connect with one another and they want to care for one another, right? Like that was my landing spot, so to speak. And it was also my point of departure. And the challenge in coordinating their interactions with each other was navigating how difficult it was for them to do that from time to time. The ways in which their attempts at connecting and caring shifted over the course of the novel, and how it could be challenging to put that care into words, even if they began from a standpoint of wanting to distribute that care. But they did and do want to distribute that care. Because that wasn't a question for me, the dialogue, even though it took a certain amount of editing, even though it took a certain amount of time to calibrate to an emotional and just like a speed that made structural like an emotional sense to me. I had a sense of like where I wanted to go and how I wanted it to feel. So the editing process was a matter of like trying to get closer and closer and closer to that. And that is similar, I think, to the editing process and to the drafting process that I have for quite a lot of my fiction, right? Like having a pre-existing sense of like how I want to feel or how I want a reader to feel, and editing toward that feeling or editing with that feeling in mind. I think it's very seldom that that Venn diagram of like what is envisioned and intended and like what is actualized on the text is like a complete circle in many different ways. It's probably like why people write so many books, or like why write more books, and why I spend time with the exact same question moving from book to book. But the specificity inside of that Venn diagram from book to book um, makes for, I think, projects that, for me at least as a writer, are worth working through and spending time on question wise, and hopefully create very specific individual worlds for the reader to spend time in.
There's a lot of characters. I mean, I know it focuses on the core three, but I'm wondering for you, do you have like a favorite, I guess, like side character that you crafted in this book that you would like to speak about that maybe you haven't spoken about yet, like in interviews, or because there's a lot of characters in here. I want to make
Such an
sure we
interesting
focus on
question.
all of them. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Diego is probably my favorite character in Family Meal. A favorite is strong. He's probably the character that quite a lot of care, I think, on my end is like taken and attempted to be shown toward each character, but with his character in particular, because it felt interesting to me to have a character who was not removed from the questions that Cam and TJ and Kai were circling around, but who was one, his own person navigating his own particular experience and this like larger constellation of experiences that these characters were having with one another, but also experiencing the reverberations of the decisions and of the changes that each of the narrators were navigating in real time, right? Because Cam is actively working on himself, so to speak, and navigating certain challenges that impacts how he interacted with Diego, for example. The same was true to some extent of TJ as well, because of TJ and Cam's interactions with Kai at various points in time that interacted how they related to and interacted with Diego, for example, even though Diego is his own person living his own life in his own particular revolution. That, for me, the relationship between Diego and so many of the other characters in the narrative felt as if though it was like a tiny map in and of itself, for a larger question that I was circling around of how the interactions that we might think are like the most important in our life, capital I important, or that present themselves as being like the most quote unquote like significant in our life, have so many ripples into the other relationships and interactions in our life, and how challenging it can be, how impossible it is in a lot of ways for us to know the impact of those ripples, or the impact of, I suppose, that aftershock. At the beginning of Cam's interactions with Diego, there's no way he could have known that they would build and have a sort of friendship that develops over the course of the novel, but it does. And that is the result of like individual decisions that they're making that they may not necessarily feel are interconnected or related to one another or have causality between each other. And that feels true to life, right? And the way that relationships can change or take forms that we didn't necessarily anticipate them taking or changing in.
Yeah, I mean, I love Diego is one of my favorite characters as well. But what you just spoke on is like the ways that relationship change in ways that we might not expect or might not understand. Instantly thinking about Cam and Kai's relationship post Kai's passing is how he's appearing as like, or how Cam is still communicating with him after, or how he's seeing him. And so this is like, I guess, a two-part question for you is how did you think about exploring that aspect of grief? And once you explore Kai's perspective, this is actually a completely side question, so maybe I'll just save it. But I want to ask you about doing the audiobook narration of it, and if that kind of like, I don't know, taught you anything about the narrative after, or anything you want to share on that too.
Yeah, I think that for me, like I've been fortunate to have a hand in the audiobook narration of like each of the books that I've written, and that experience in and of itself has one shown me like a deep appreciation for the folks who do that, because that's a really fucking hard job. Like that's just like a hard gig, like to translate not only emotion in and of itself, but to try to like embody a particular character in a very particular way that is like somewhat divorced from embodying that character like on the screen, or like in a visual component, like a present component, but still can't reveal itself to be that. It still is the character. It has to be the character. So like, I'm very appreciative of folks who read audiobooks. But I think that that experience of reading also has been useful from a structural standpoint, in that the pacing of a character's progression, or the ways in which a character changes over time, like the literal pace at which that happens, has become more palpable for me, or rather, I've grown to appreciate how that can be tracked, like from the reader, the audiences, and because I'm literally reading the ways in which this person is changed, and how I'm intending for like a reader or an audience to understand those changes have occurred over 50 pages, or over the course of 100 pages, or over the course of 300 pages. Having, I suppose, an interaction with like that immediate change and that context of just like speaking it, I think upon my initial readings of like earlier works, just really impacted my sense of like what is viable structurally, or what feels viable structurally, or what feels like a concrete way, or concrete ways, or some of the concrete ways through which like to track like the emotional weight of a narrative, and how that can change over the course of a narrative. But I think that for Kai's voice, what I knew, particularly as I was coming out of that prior question of like, I do not want, trauma to supersede the entirety of this narrative, or I do not want it to become a narrative that is solely about the loss of a partner by way of the state, because I knew that these two things had to be true for me in the narrative. The question became how not to do that, or how to work around that. And what I ultimately landed on was having an active voice for Kai, having him be active not only in his individual sections, but in the sections of Cam as well, right? So he's a ghost that, we're introduced to in Cam's section, and then we hear his voice in his own sections. And the book, well, I don't know if I can say that, but we see different iterations of him as the novel progresses. That felt really important to me because rather than a narrative in which this is a person that this horrible structural violence was inflicted upon, he's a character that your reader is spending time with over the course of this book in this larger ecosystem of relationships and like in a very active way. It took me quite a while to reach the point where I felt as if though that were viable, but most distressingly, I think, or more distressingly, I was very tentative about even including his voice to begin with because I wasn't sure if it was something that could be done in a way that felt emotionally satisfying and also structurally satisfying. And that I think was useful. I think it proved itself to be useful because oftentimes when I'm working on a project, whether short form or long form, there will be a point that I reach in which I'm not sure if this is a thing that can be done, or this is a thing that maybe I haven't seen so many cops for, or this is a thing that would be like scary to do. And I get to ask myself why and how that would change the narrative if I actually chose to do that or I actually attempted to do that. I think that I am less interested in success, so to speak, from a structural vantage point or from like an execution vantage point than in trying to expand an experience or attempt to make an experience as immediate as possible for a reader or an audience. And when I reach those moments where there's a component of the narrative where I ask myself, can I do that? Or does that track for me, or have I seen other iterations of narratives in which this was accomplished in a way that left me like emotionally satisfied and also felt as if though it made a structural sense. That's generally the sort of decision where it's like, well, I can at least try. I can at least do an iteration of it and then see if that works out. Because if it doesn't work, I can take it out. At the very least, I've spent more time with these characters. I've gained a further sense of who they are, who they aren't, which I think can be just as important from a drafting vantage point.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear how like even some things that might be, left out of the final draft that we read as readers can still inform the way a writer kind of thinks about the character or comes to the character that we see. I'm curious, last question for you is just book recommendations generally, but I'm wondering if there's anything in particular that informed this book or otherwise anything you're reading now you want to share.
Yeah, thank you for that question. For the latter, I just finished on because I was on a plane from the Bay Area yesterday, and I'll be like on a plane like to the UK shortly. So I just finished The Vulnerables by Sigrid Nunes, which is like a really great book. It's like a scary good book. I'm excited to hear how people talk about it. A little while ago, I finished Exhibit by Aro Kwan, which is a phenomenal book and which will be coming out in early 2024. I spent time with Dolki Men's walking practice, which is translated by Victoria Cottle, which is a really interesting story about pleasure, a really interesting story about the ways in which it can like change a person and what one can do or what one might feel that they should do to reach that pleasure. And also another last rec would be Happy Stories Mostly by Norman Erickson Pasaribu, which is translated by Tiffany Sao, a short story collection that is also about pleasure, that is also about queerness, that is also about the different things that people can do or like feel compelled to do in order to achieve that. But when I was writing Family Meal, Jacqueline Woodson's Another Brooklyn is a book that was really important to me from a structural standpoint, but also from like the vantage point of seeing how many experiences can be captured in a narrative from the vantage point of even just one individual narrator. It is elliptical in a way that was really important to me and that feels and felt really important to me. And also The Housekeeper and the Professor by Joko Ogawa. That was another book that was really important to me from a structural standpoint of like tracking like how a relationship can change over time, even if we know the eventual outcome for a particular character, even if we know that this particular character is deceased or will no longer at least be active in the novel or the project by the end of the narrative. We know that from the outset. How can we still involve and invite that character into the narrative and to build a relationship between that character and the reader in such a way that you don't necessarily forget what the trajectory of that character is, but it doesn't completely overwhelm your sense of like who this person is and like in these individual scenes or in these individual moments. Those were two books that were and are really important to me and that I kind of carried around wherever I was whenever I was in the midst of like drafting the book.
Yeah, thank you for sharing those. I'm always curious to know like what was kind of like top of mind or what was an influence for you, just because I mean the way that you talk about fiction is so fascinating. I can listen to you talk all day about it. It's so fascinating to me because like that's why I do this podcast is because I am not a writer myself, but when I'm reading, I'm like, how did a writer do this? So this is my way of trying to nail that down for myself.
Oh,
So
it's very much appreciated. Yeah, no, yeah, it's super appreciated.
thank you, Bryan, for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, Jalen, and for like the thoughtfulness of your questions and like the care behind them. It's very much appreciated.